Today's lecture is about Ontario's Green Energy and Green Economy Act of 2009. It was introduced in 2009. They started working on it in 2003. And they updated again in 2013. There's a lot of information in this act. The purpose of the act is there are many purposes, we'll talk about them, but mostly it's about creating incentives to shift the economy away from coal and other fossil fuels towards solar energy and wind energy and other renewables. There are technical problems when it comes to creating wind and solar energy compared with fossil fuels. Mostly it's just how extremely cheap it is to get effective fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia can do it for about $10 per gallon of oil. And it is incredibly, there's so much power in a gallon of oil. You'd be shocked how much, well, it's explosive how much power there is in there. But we're not going to be talking about the technical aspects of solar and wind energy compared to oil. We're just going to be talking about the economics. We're going to be talking about what it means for a government to set a policy and then economically how they can achieve it. So let's list what the goals of the policy were. First, as I said, was to increase the investment in wind and solar energies. Okay, fair enough. Second was to promote conservation. Conservation, they just want you to reduce your energy consumption. Third was to create wind, solar businesses. This is 2009, there weren't that many, and they wanted to create more businesses. Fourth, they wanted to increase employment in these areas. And fifth, they wanted to reduce greenhouse gases. GHGs, greenhouse gases. We're going to be looking at these goals one by one. Yes?
I was wondering if water source energy.
That wasn't a big thing. It was mostly focused on wind and solar. We're going to be going through these goals one by one and just talking about the economics of having such a goal. And the reason they had these goals is because we were living in an economy that wasn't at those targets, so they want to shift away. So the process of transition, economically, what would that mean? So let's go through these one by one. Increasing incentives, or increasing investment. Investment, so increase investment in wind and solar. If we have an economy that was 100% based on fossil fuels, what can we say, and we had the technology to get on wind and solar. Wind and solar were the first technologies we used for transportation, right? Boats used to run on wind, solar used to heat our homes, and then it was after we discovered how wonderful and cheap oil is, and David Rockefeller was a major influence in getting this to that cheapness. But let's say we've evolved now as a society to the point where we've only been using fossil fuels for our energy needs. What can we just say about such a society if we know its past was to use wind and solar, and its present is to just use fossil fuels? What can we just say about that society? What can we say? Anything at all? Yes?
It's unsustainable because they're finite.
It's unsustainable because it's finite. We can talk about that, but just not something more general. Yes?
Infrastructure is focused on fossil fuels.
Yes, so you have a lot of your infrastructure is already geared towards running on fossil fuels. Anything else? Yes?
They've chosen to like focus on a specific source of energy, and therefore they've decreased the feasibility of using substitutes.
So they've chosen to focus on a specific source of energy. It decreases the feasibility of substitutes. Why is that?
Again,
The infrastructure has changed. Any other reason?
I guess socially, you're not used to thinking about the alternative of using alternatives.
That's a good point. Maybe people have just forgotten about the benefits of wind and solar. Maybe they've just forgotten. Anything else? Let's see, that's Sam. Yeah.
Greenhouse gases are cheaper to produce. They could prioritize financial gain over sustainable resources.
Yeah. So there could just be base financial incentives. It was just the cheapest thing to do. It was the cheapest thing to do. You had your hand up too?
Yeah, similarly, like the short-term profits are prioritized more than the long-term.
Okay. Yes.
So the fossil fuel industry provides jobs.
Provides jobs. That's going to be another goal we'll be talking about soon. Any other points? Okay. So we said there was the infrastructure. We already had fossil fuel infrastructure. We had a fossil fuel culture. And fossil fuel means lower costs. If people voluntarily chose to move away from solar and wind to fossil fuels, that must mean that at that time that they made their choice, that they expected the benefits from fossil fuels to be greater than the benefits that they were receiving from wind and solar. Yes?
Just good points. For if you want to heat a space, if you do it directly with sun, it's actually more efficient and obviously more cost effective than fossil fuels. So it would be possibly dependent on application.
Right, so by application, sure. So every application will be different. If you have an apartment building, a high rise, probably easier to heat that up with fossil fuels than with solar.
They, in the past couple of years, they started doing like more design buildings, like possibly like Montreal or Ottawa. There were a couple of like test buildings in Canada where they were incorporating solar more, and I think they had it possibly 100% passive solar.
100% passive solar.
For like an apartment building. So
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into that. I come from Iran, and a popular housing type in Iran is a low-rise apartment, about 3 or 4 stories, and it's got an empty atrium in the center with a window, and then at the bottom there's a little garden, and then all the apartments have windows facing this atrium, and then you get sunlight from the outside, and then also sunlight from the inside. But in Iran, we also have heavily subsidized fossil fuel prices, so people still heat and cool their homes with fossil fuels. But 100% would be pretty interesting. But generally, the point was that when people are making these transitions, at the point of the transition, they expect the benefits to outweigh the costs. So now, if the government comes in and says, we want to increase investments in wind and solar, what are some obstacles to this? What are some economic obstacles to this? Yes?
The infrastructure is solely based on fossil fuels, so having to move everything over to wind and solar would be very expensive and costly and take a lot of time.
Right, so you'd have to reverse a couple hundred years of infrastructure development. Yes?
If you're investing in if you're investing in like, obviously like something that's like supposed to be not like good for the economy, and you're having to convince businesses and people that like it's okay to go into like a few years of like losing money.
Yes? So you have to do a lot of convincing, cajoling that people have to lose money for a while. Any other economics? Yes?
You have to like convince people to go from being already invested in fossil fuels, and you have to convince them to enter into a more uncertain market instead.
Yes, so there's uncertainty too. So at the time you don't have the technology to produce as much energy out of wind and solar. So you say, you have to make promises saying that if we invest today, it will be just as good, maybe even better in the future. But that's a lot of uncertainty. Predicting the future is always full of uncertainty. Any other questions? Yeah?
I mean, it would certainly like impact the market on its own, especially if it was to raise the price of oil. A lot of really large companies will struggle.
Let's talk about the price of oil. If we have a simple supply and demand for the price of oil, investing in wind and solar, how's that going to affect supply and demand for the price of oil? Yes?
To decrease demand.
It'll decrease demand. Anyone have a different idea? Who agrees decreases demand? Who disagrees? It will decrease the demand for oil. Deep breath. Decreases demand means we get a decrease in quantity consumed. This was the original. Decrease in quantity consumed. And a decrease in price. What about if we're looking at the supply and demand now for, call this FF, for greens, solar and wind. If this was the market for solar and wind, what would happen after an increase in investment in solar and wind sources? What would shift? Would anything shift? Yes?
The quantity supplied might increase.
The quantity supplied might increase, but what would cause the quantity supplied to increase? What would shift?
The supply curve would be shifting out.
The supply curve would be shifted out. The supply curve would be shifted out. If the supply curve shifted out, the quantity supplied would increase. The quantity demanded would also increase. But you'd get a decrease in prices. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Let me ask you this. Where is the money going to come from to invest in fossil fuels, or sorry, to invest in green energy sources? Taxes, right? It's the government doing this. So the government is going to be increasing taxes in order to fund this shift in the supply curve. When the government increases taxes, is that just free money for the government? Is that free money for the economy? Are there any other costs to increasing taxes? Yes?
If you increase taxes, the disposable income of like each person would decrease, so they'd have less, like, I guess, free activity in the market.
When you increase taxes, the disposable income for everyone else in the society decreases. That means we're going to be losing out on all the other things you would have spent your money on. If your disposable income per month was $1,000, and then this was an extra $10 of tax per month. That's maybe a couple less lattes per month for you, maybe. Maybe $10 less you would have donated to charity. Maybe $10 less you would have saved towards a retirement, so you would have to retire a little bit later. All those other things that you don't see because of this increase in taxes. What would happen to all those other industries that have been impacted by this? What would happen to their supply and demand curve? Would it look like one of these two? Or would it look like something else? Yes? Their demand would decrease. Is that all that would happen? Anyone have a different guess? Yeah. Well, quantity supplied changes when either the demand changes or the supply changes. So the quantity supply would change. What would cause it to change? Why would the supply curve shift out? You're getting there. You're getting there. So here's how that would look like. So if this is market for everything else, and the government has just taxed everyone who isn't in the green industries to fund the green industries, everyone becomes that much poorer. So of course, all the consumers will have less money to spend on their demand, but producers as well will also have less money to spend on investments and marketing and other sorts of activities designed to bring goods to market. So the supply curve will also shift in. Supply curve shifts in, the demand curve shifts in. All we know was that if this was the original quantity supplied and demanded, the new equilibrium quantity will be less than the original, but prices could go up or could go down depending on which side was impacted more, depending on the specific elasticities. Does that make sense? So, going back to our goals, the second one was to, well, we could just talk about this. The second one was to promote conservation. Promote conservation. Conservation means you're just using less stuff than before. If previously you were enjoying your life consuming, I don't know what the units would be, however many units of fossil fuels. Say you're driving, and you drive, you take a whole 2 weeks to use a full tank of gas. And then with this new government plan, the government says, please conserve your fossil fuel consumption. So now instead of taking 2 weeks to use a whole tank of gas, you drive less. And then you're now using, it now takes you 3 weeks to take up a whole tank of gas. You're driving less to conserve your fossil fuel use. Are you better off, worse off, or indeterminate? Yes.
I feel like you could argue that the person would be worse off because they would be less productive and get less stuff done.
So the argument is that they would be less productive, they would get less stuff done. Yes?
I think it's subjective if you really want to conserve energy and save the environment, then maybe this is a good thing. So it's subjective of what you think is efficient.
It's subjective. Anyone else? Yes?
It would depend a bit on your alternatives,
It would depend on your alternatives, for example, what?
like public transit.
Public transit. So yeah, let's say they were just walking. So they walked more instead of driving. But with that information, can you now say if they're better off or worse off?
It depends again, if they need exercise, they're better off.
Let's say they were already getting plenty of exercise. Are they better off or worse off? Can you say?
Worse.
They're worse off? I had a hand up there? No? Yes?
It would be indeterminate because your like transaction cost rather you like walk more would like waste your time or like that, but you're saving money to pay more for gas.
Hand up here?
Same thing with like, that it could, like, it's the same thing with the cost of their time, like, if they could walk more, that might save them time later too, where they don't go to the gym instead, so it's a trade-off as well, so it's very subjective.
Yeah. It's subjective. It's subjective to the individual person so long as they made the choice to reduce their consumption personally. If they voluntarily chose to consume less, then we have to say that they voluntarily are enjoying the benefits. That they're better off. They might be consuming less stuff from some objective point of view, that they're consuming less stuff. But just because you're consuming less stuff doesn't mean you're worse off. Value is subjective. You can get happier with less. Make sense? Of course, if the consumer is happier with less, does that mean the producers are also happier with selling less? Can we say the same thing about producers? If consumers are consuming less, can we say anything about the consumers? Or sorry, producers? Yeah.
Can it also be indeterminate because like they're spending less money to like have to produce their product, they can probably advertise it and do that better, but they are selling less.
Let's draw the supply and demand curve. We got P, we got Q, D, and S. Consumers choose to consume less. What's going to change? Demand, is it going to shift in or out? In. Demand shifts in. By this shift in demand, can we say whether consumers are better off or worse off? We have to say that they're at least as well off as they were before because they made this choice. In fact, we can actually go one better. We can say that they're better off now because they wouldn't have made this choice if they didn't think they would be better off. If consumers voluntarily choose to consume less, that means they're better off than they were before. But what about consumers or producers? Sir? What about producers? They're now selling less. Would anything happen to the supply curve? Would anything happen to the supply curve, or would it stay the same? The supply curve, yeah.
It might take some time, but if producers decide that it's no longer profitable for them to continue supplying the way they were before, the supply curve might shift as producers drop out of supplying.
The supply curve won't shift in, but they will be producing at a lower quantity and selling at a lower price. And because this is the market supply curve, there are individual producers in this area who would no longer be profitable at that price. Those producers would drop out because the price is too low. If the only thing that's changing is the price, then the curve is not shifting. Fewer producers are selling this good, and prices are lower now than they were before. it's still profitable to sell at this price for the remaining producers. But there are fewer producers, and people along this curve there, they lost money and they had to go out of business. Those producers are worse off because of the consumers choosing to consume less. Yes?
Does that apply for all businesses, or is that just for?
This would be for anything other than green electricity. So it could be, because you drive to the yoga studio. The yoga studio could shouldn't even not be a yoga studio, it could be just out in the bushes somewhere. But previously you had to drive out there to get to it. And now you're choosing to drive less, so you can't go to do your yoga in the bushes anymore. The yoga in the bushes doesn't consume any fossil fuels, except for your drive up and back. But because you're choosing to drive less, the yoga studio has to go out of business.
But someone could also benefit. Like if you decide not to drive the long way,
Yes.
to say you want Starbucks, and there's a really small coffee shop just down the street, they're gonna be the same. What they're making because you're just walking.
That's a great point. So when you're driving less, some people are benefiting. Some people are benefiting. If you're walking more, you're now walking to your local small-time coffee shop instead of driving to Starbucks. But that coffee shop's gain is Starbucks' loss. The market for producers in general loses because there's less business to go around, even though some individual businesses may benefit. Yes?
There's also like Mercedes-Benz starts selling smart cars.
Yeah, so people would have to, so that would be a long-term solution. That would be a technological response to a lower demand. That might then shift the supply curve. Did you guys do in your readings the concept of producer surplus and consumer surplus? Does that come up? Yes? Can you draw the producer surplus here? No? Producer surplus is anything under the price above the supply curve, and consumer surplus is anything over the price below the demand curve. When the demand curve shifts in, producer surplus definitely gets smaller. And we can also say that consumer surplus in that situation got smaller, but maybe they were benefiting in other industries as well. They're walking. So, let's talk about point 3. You want to create, we'll do 3 and 4 together. Create wind and solar businesses and jobs. The government, we already talked about, is using tax money to subsidize the development of new wind and solar construction, etc. This is creating an opportunity to create new businesses to then get this government money. Right? If the government just announces we're going to be spending, $10 billion over the next few years to produce wind producers, and then you've got some extra money, and you think about what to do, probably a good idea to get into the wind business. And I haven't talked about this yet, but how they're actually subsidizing the wind businesses under this act is something called feed-in tariff. Feed-in tariffs. Who's heard of feed-in tariffs? We've heard about regular tariffs, right? Trump doesn't talk about regular tariffs, but for international companies, etc. feed-in tariffs are applied to government contractors, where the government will pay some contractors more than others based on their method of production. So the government is going to be offering a fossil fuel producer something like 3 cents per megawatt hour or something like that. But they'll offer the same, or they'll offer a wind producer 12 cents per megawatt hour. 4 times as much money for the same good. But now they want to create businesses and jobs. Well, they'll definitely create new businesses. But will they create new businesses on net? You're shaking your head.
I don't think so, because if you're making new businesses, you're putting other ones out of business. If you're charging them more.
Well, let's think of it this way. Do the same businesses exist today as they did 100 years ago? Some, but if you counted all the individual businesses today, and counted all the individual businesses, even I'll make it easier, 500 years ago, would they be more or less today than 500 years ago?
More today.
They're way more today. Are they the same businesses as there were today as 500 years ago? No. One of the oldest, by fun fact, one of the oldest corporations in the world is the Hudson Bay Company. It's founded about 500 years ago. So businesses evolve. We can get to a society that's rich enough to support lots of businesses, even though some businesses go out of business. Is that what's going to be happening under this government scheme to use tax money to fund new businesses? Yes?
Wouldn't you be creating like more areas of specialization?
You would be. You would be creating more wind and solar businesses, for sure. But I'm asking on net, would the Ontario economy have more businesses and more jobs on net? Or would it be the same, or would it be less? Yes?
I'm gonna guess more because like this economy's that dependent on fossil fuels in terms of like energy production.
So we have one person saying more. Anyone saying the same? The same? You say the same?
Because back then, the population was so much smaller than it is today, so the population is, if you just change where the population is the same, then the amount of people who go is the same, because other businesses are.
Okay. So they'll go out of business because some companies will go out of business, but other companies will come in, so it'll roughly balance out. People will switch from fossil fuel to energy, green energy, sure. Anyone say it'll go down? The total number of businesses will go down. Why?
Just it kind of came from the reading when we were doing the carbon tax debate. It was the idea that because like the government's forcing that change instead of like the choices of consumers, you're losing all the money in transaction, or like it would hurt the amount of businesses.
In transition, you mean? Yeah. So that's almost, so let's just think about that. So how did we say the government is going to be incentivizing new businesses? We said taxes. And we said that the taxes are going to be taking money from the incomes of other consumers and producers. So we had the supply and demand curve for the rest of the market shift in, right? The whole market shifts in. That's less stuff people are able to afford. That's less income people will have. If you have less income, what's going to happen? We said that there are going to be businesses going out of business. People are not going to have the same amount of money to visit new businesses. They'll still have to get around, so they'll still have, they still need to keep their houses warm in the winter, so they'll have to consume energy. And it doesn't matter for them where that energy comes from, whether it's wind or solar. But they'll have less money to do anything else. So yeah.
can you just explain like the shifts in supply and demand in that graph?
So just to repeat, government taxes, you as a consumer have less money to spend on consumption goods. As a consumer, you have less disposable income to spend on consumption goods. So your demand curve shifts in. Your income changes, so your demand curve shifts in. As a producer, your income also changes. You have less income to invest in your business. You have less income to hire new employees. So you might actually be forced to fire some employees. You might have been just on the margin, and then now you've lost some income to taxes, so you might have to let some people go. So the supply curve also shifts in. That money then goes to the government, who then uses it to fund these green energy companies. The question is, will these green energy companies be providing jobs for everyone who just got displaced? I'm going to propose no. Because if there was already, so you got to remember, this was already, we were here. That was already efficient. We had to take money away from everyone, and we're promising to make the economy more efficient in the future. But at the very least in the present, we're creating a lot of inefficiencies. We're forcing the economy to be more inefficient today through the force of taxes, with the hope or expectation that it'll be more efficient in the future. And again, that goes, whether it will be or not, that's a technical debate. And that's going to come up in some of the readings that they'll discuss the technical problems of renewable energies as the technology currently exists today. But we don't need to assume anything about the technologies for this argument. All we know is that on net, at least when the government starts this program, we're going to have a net loss of jobs and businesses. Yes, in the back.
Okay, so 2008 would have been like recession. So I'm assuming, I don't remember, but possibly government was running a deficit. So like how much of this would have been coming from tax and would have been affecting like businesses at that time?
So the governments run deficits by raising bonds, right? Raising money through bonds. Bonds are kind of special in that you can just think of a bond as a loan to the government, but governments also have laws in place that require financial institutions to buy bonds from them, that they have to hold a certain number of bonds legally. So that's one complication. A second complication was that central banks in 2008 were financing a lot of these bond purchases. So just to go over chapter 14, how the 2008 how central banks responded to the 2008 crisis was that the private banks bought government bonds at a high price because everyone was trying to buy the same bonds, so prices were bid up for government bonds. But then they went around and sold those same bonds at an even higher price to the central banks. And where does the central bank get its money from? The government? Where does the central bank get its money from? The Fed is a central bank. Where does the Fed get its money from?
Oh, nothing. Like this kind of makes it.
The central banks create money out of thin air. There's a fancy Latin word for this. It's called ex nihilo. It means out of nothing. They just have an account. Private banks have an account at the central bank, and then private banks transfer the ownership of the government bonds to the central bank. And the central bank just adds a couple of zeros to the checking accounts, basically, of these private banks. There was no actual money beforehand. They just added a bunch of zeros. We call that inflation. Increasing the money supply. What happens to the value of the rest of your money? Goes down. Is that effectively any different than a tax? If the value of your money goes down, you can buy fewer goods and services. If you get taxed, you get to buy fewer goods and services. So inflation is a tax. We call it the inflation tax. Inflation is a tax. People still end up buying fewer goods and services, whether they're purchased through this kind of central banking government funding or through direct taxes. So we actually ran out of time, but that was actually all I wanted to talk about. So perfect. See you guys on Monday.